Welcome and good evening. We have a fantastic turnaround, a full house in Exeter tonight for this discussion on Ask the Experts on the referendum. It's an event organized by the university with support from the Economic and Social Research Council's program on the UK in a Changing Europe. I will now introduce the speakers before we start with some questions that we collected through the website from you, and we expect then to also have an open session when we're done with the questions that we have already received and distributed among the experts on the panel. The experts on the panel, I start from my left, are Susan Banducci, who is a professor of political science here at Exeter University, and she's the director of the Q-STEP Center at Exeter. She's the expert on public opinion, so questions on public opinion will mostly go to Susan in the first place. The second person is Sam Robbins. Sam is an honorary fellow at the Center for European Governance here at Exeter. You can see the banner down there. And she's our expert on financial services, monetary economy, financial markets regulation. He has experience at the Treasury here in the UK, and is also an experience not just of monetary markets in the UK, but also as negotiator on several EU Council working parties. So the third person here is Alison Harcourt. She's one of the senior research fellows on the program I mentioned before, the UK in a Changing Europe, and she's leading on a project on the UK communication industries and the options opened by the referendum. She's a professor of public policy analysis here at Exeter University. So you're an expert on regulation as well as particularly on the regulation of the media and communication industries. Now, turning to my right, we have Professor Iain Begg, who is a research professor at the European Institute of the London School for Economics. She's our political economist. His work is eminently in the field of economic governance, blending economics and political science. He's one of the ESRC fellows on the program UK in a Changing Europe. Then we have Catherine Barnard from the University of Cambridge. She's again a ESRC fellow on the program the UK in a Changing Europe. She's a professor of European law at Cambridge, and she has an interesting project for this program called Honeypot Britain, the lived experience of working as an EU migrant in the UK. So she can take questions on migrations as well as, let's say, questions of social policy and law. And on my right, again, is Professor James Devenney, who's a professor of commercial law here at Exeter, as well as the head of our law school. So she will take some of the legal questions, but they can also be distributed to Catherine. That's all for the introduction. My name is Claudio Radaelli, and I'm the director of the Center for European Governance, that one here at Exeter. Okay, so it's time to start. We start with the questions. Those questions were coming through the week, through the website, and we also checked as far as possible that the people who asked the questions are present tonight. So let's see if that works. The first question I have is from Claudia Dope. Is she here?
Yep.
She is. Okay, great. And I'm just checking that the next will be by Roger Cornick, so down here, so that the microphone will travel down here. And we can start. Yeah.
Okay, my question is, what impact do you think either outcome, stay or go, will have on the value and strength of the pound, both against the euro and other currencies?
Okay, so I guess my answer to that is in two parts. The first is sort of what the market is saying about this. And I'm sure you're aware since the back end of last year, there's been about a 10% slump in sterling against most major currencies, against the US dollar and the euro. And the forward-looking projections of implied volatility and the like suggest that there will be a further correction in the event of leaving or a bounce back if we vote to stay. So in the short term, at least, the market is predicting that there will be a change. And if that were to leave, then that would be a further downward correction. And I think it's also important because, I mean, markets say all sorts of things. They can often be wrong. To think a bit about the fundamentals of our economy. And we are currently running a record current account deficit. Mm-hmm. Now, that of itself doesn't mean that our currency will necessarily devalue, but that only survives as long as we are getting those nations who are in surplus against us are continuing to be willing to buy assets in the UK. And a lot of that has been founded on us being a sort of a stable place, a safe haven in the world. So I think I'm not going to sort of answer definitively on that, but I think it is worth thinking, what those investors will think in a world where it's not clear what the state, the status quo will be once we've renegotiated with the EU, with other countries, what our legal framework will be at that point. So I think the fundamentals are that it seems to suggest that there will be certainly some great uncertainty for some time.
Excellent, thank you, Sam. We move to Roger. Wait a sec, the mic is coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. David Cameron struck an agreement with the EU leaders back in February, and I would like to know if that deal has the force of law, be it international, EU, or otherwise. Thank you.
So I started by answering that question by saying, as in many things, lawyers disagree on this. The weight of opinion is that it is binding. It would be subject to interpretation by the Court of Justice of the European Union, as would all such agreements. It has been registered with the UN. So the weight of opinion is that it does have the force of law at the moment before the ratification of the EU instruments. But lawyers do disagree on this.
Okay, thank you. I'm just checking that we have the next two speakers, Penny Amroui. Penny, is there? And do we also have Bridget Bailey? We do. Okay, great. So those will be the next two questions. Thank you.
Okay. What would leaving the EU mean for the UK in terms of security and defence?
James, can you take these as well?
Yes, this one's been given to me, although this one's outside of my area of expertise. I think my thoughts on that are that in terms of security, we are, of course, plugged into the EU network in terms of security. So leaving the EU would affect that, but one would expect or one would anticipate that would be replaced, and it would be in everyone's interest to replace that with bilateral agreements in relation to the sharing of security data, etc. I suppose the difficulty would be in terms of time, in terms of negotiating those kind of bilateral replacement arrangement in relation to security.
Okay, thank you. Bridget has the next question.
Is a referendum a suitable vehicle for decision-making when the issues are highly complex and difficult to understand?
I guess I'm asking Susan to answer this one.
Yes, can you hear me? Is that okay? All right, I'll talk loudly into the mic. And I'm afraid, Bridget, I'm going to start the answer in the same way that James began the answer to the last question, and that is, some would suggest that this is such an important question that, yes, we should let the people decide. And others would argue that, no, it is too complex for people to understand. But it is a complex issue. You can see we have a panel of experts, and we do also have access to the internet in case some of the questions get too difficult to help us sort them out. So there are some complexities to the issues that we're asked to consider coming up to the referendum, and it's an unusual event in the UK to have a referendum. This is only the third UK-wide referendum to be held. The first one over 40 years ago on the first on membership in the European Economic Community. But I think what's important to consider is whether or not the outcome of the referendum vote can be seen as democratically legitimate. Is it a legitimate decision and a legitimate preference that's been expressed by voters? So in terms of that, we can think about three things. One, are voters informed? Are they competent? Are they informed enough to make their preferences known in the election? So the polling that's been done, and it asks people, do you feel informed enough to express your preference in the upcoming referendum? And back in February, most people said, or the majority said, no, I don't feel informed enough. And still the numbers are quite high. We're conducting some polling with ICM, and people still feel uninformed. But I think that has to do with the competing claims that we hear. And so sorting through that is part of the issue. But second of all, when people vote, are they voting on the basis of issues that are related to the question of the EU? And I think that is hugely important. And there's a range of issues that are connected to the EU. Some of them have already been raised about security. We'll talk about immigration. We'll already talked about the currency, the value of the currency, and about the economy. So if people are expressing preferences that are based on a consideration of those issues, that's another measure of whether or not we have a legitimate decision. So sometimes the worry is that when you vote in a referendum, you're voting on the basis of other issues, whether you like Boris Johnson or whether you think the government is doing a good job. And that was the worry in some, I think in the Dutch held a referendum recently on an EU question, and they felt that the preferences were basically related to questions about the economy, not about Ukraine, which was the issue. But finally, and this I think is the most important point about whether or not the outcome of the referendum can be seen as legitimate, and that has to do with turnout. Who's voting in the referendum? And at the moment, we know that turnout is always skewed in elections, and the concern is that younger voters will not be voting in this election. The campaign, what you want is the information in a campaign and the salience of particular issues should mobilize voters. It should inform them and it should mobilize them. And the worry has been from commentators is that the campaigns are not yet speaking to younger voters on the issues that they're concerned about. So the concern is that younger voters won't turn out. And that, I think, may be a problem with then questioning the legitimacy of the outcome of the referendum.
Then we have Roberto Franceschini, is in the audience there. Yeah, you'll get the microphone in a second. Let's check that everyone can hear your question.
Yes, Roberto Franceschini, chairman of the Devon branch of the European Movement. Our members ask this question, and it's in two parts. I'll be brief. How realistic are any options proposed by Brexit supporters in securing access to the single market by the United Kingdom? The second part is, what would the consequences and costs to UK citizens of failure to do so or to comply with any new conditions likely to be imposed?
Okay, thank you, Roberto. That's a question for Alison.
Okay. On the single market, I think that the chances of remaining in the single market are very high. And I think that whether we're in or out, we will be able to belong to the single market as Norway does or Switzerland does through EFTA. However, I think that there will be costs. Certainly, the single market, of course, entails the freedom of movement of people, of movement of capital, of movement of goods, and of movement of services. Yeah. So, if we were trying to compromise any of those freedoms, there could be repercussions. I don't think that the UK could renegotiate single market access without free movement of people, for example. There is an example from Switzerland where Switzerland brought in quite stringent immigration laws, and what the European Commission did was remove research funding, which was quite dramatic for the Swiss. There have been estimates about loss to the UK. I can give a lot of examples in the broadcast industry, the communications markets, because that's my sector. Certainly, from the surveys that I've seen, they are worried about access to European market in the video games industry, in broadcast from the UK, because we have 640 channels licensed in the UK that broadcast across Europe. We're very familiar with B-Sky B, but Sky also broadcasts to Italy, Sky Italia. They also broadcast to Germany, Sky Deutschland, so they are making use of economies of scale, but because they have the UK license, they're also able to avoid more stringent restrictions in countries in the EU. There's a lot of companies broadcasting here, Disney, Discovery, NBC, and so forth. But also the LSE, the London School of Economics Centre for Economic Performance, calculated that leaving the EU would cause overseas investment in the UK to fall. So foreign direct investment, FDI, could fall by around a fifth, according to one of their reports, even if the UK secured sort of a Norway-like deal where they were in the EEA, the European Economic Area.
Excellent. Okay, the next question by Michael Rush. We see you're here. Yes, you just need the microphone to get to.
My question is in the event of a leave or Brexit vote, what is the likely impact on Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
That's a question on the impact on Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we will ask James again to help us.
I think the interesting part to that question is in relation to Scotland and the impact a vote to leave the EU might have on Scottish independence and perhaps a second referendum in Scotland. So I think that there are very interesting questions around independence in Scotland and if should the UK leave the EU. Ireland's a very interesting question as well, with the very soft border now between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And should the UK leave the EU, that would become a much harder border than it is at the moment. There are, of course, concerns that the impact that might have on the peace process in Ireland, but I think that remains to be seen.
Kevin Butler, we were corresponding as well. Yes.
Good evening, panel. The Brexit case appears to be based on principles of self-determination, control over our borders, reallocation of budgetary resources, and longer-term economic benefit, although we haven't heard a lot about the fourth of those. Which of these principles should have priority and why?
Thank you. Great question. And we ask Iain to help us with this.
Well, I'm here neither to make the Brexit case nor the Remain case, because we're all neutral, aren't we, Claudio?
Yes. Our job is to provide evidence so that people can form their
opinion. We're supposed to be
opinions.
egregiously neutral. So let me try to address components of the question. First, on the democratic deficit, which is behind what you were talking about. Democratic deficit is one of these very curious phrases that's repeatedly bandied around, and yet nobody bothers to define for us. You all have the opportunity, in one respect, to vote for members of the European Parliament. Voting for a member of Parliament, even if it's the European one, is a form of democracy. We also have, at European level, the fact that the Council of Ministers is the representatives of national governments. They have a mandate coming from their respective governments and peoples. So they too are an exercise of a form of democracy. And yet we hear, by the same token, that everything is done behind closed doors in Brussels. Backroom deals. It used to be smoke-filled rooms, but now they've banned smoking as well. So the democratic deficit is where there are executive decisions taken of various kinds. And here we have to be aware that there are some functions of government. Is that MI5? There are some functions of government where we decide collectively that we want to delegate. The Bank of England is independent. It sets monetary policy independently. It isn't democratically controlled the way it used to be before it was set free. Competition authorities have to be independent because they need to be the referees rather than subject to pressures from politicians. So there's a dilemma here about what forms of government you want to be executive and what forms you want to be subject to very direct scrutiny by either parliamentarians or by elected bodies of different sorts. And I don't think there's an easy answer to this at European level. Now, the second element to your question was to do with the finances. You will have heard the stories. You'll have heard Vote Leave telling you that we send £350 million a week to Brussels. It sounds dramatic. It buys a huge number of nurses. Just one catch, it's wrong. The true figure is around 280, which is still a lot of money, I agree, but they're misleading you by ignoring the fact that since 1984, the UK has had a rebate on its contributions, and it's not as though you pay that and then get the money back. It's a bit like paying tax. If, like Claudio, you're on a massive income of £100,000 a year,
True.
You're in the 40% tax bracket, but you don't pay 40% of your income in tax and then get your personal allowance back or your allowance for the lower rate back. You only pay the net amount, and that's what Britain does. So the figure that we pay is much less than is being claimed by the Leave campaign. It's nevertheless substantial, but it depends, and here I have to take a bit of time on this, Claudio, you forgive me.
Good.
It depends a bit on what you project is going to happen to the British economy. If it's bigger, if the British economy is bigger on either scenario, then it's better for the public finances. If you lose 1 percentage point of GDP on any scenario, you're going to lose tax revenue, and that just about offsets what we contribute to Brussels every year. So you have to put the two things together rather than regard them in isolation. You talked as well, I think, about the trade balance as one aspect of your question. The UK runs at the moment, as Alison's already indicated, as Sam already indicated, a substantial trade deficit vis-à-vis the EU. But that's for two reasons. One is that the EU economy has been stagnating, so we're not selling as many exports. And second, it's because the British economy is not performing well enough in exporting. And then you have to ask the question, well, which scenario is going to be most conducive to higher exports in the future? And nobody really has an answer to that. We depend on this, but there's also an imbalance in negotiations. For the UK, 12% of our economy depends on exports to the EU. For the EU, only 3% of their economy depends on exports to us. And that asymmetry means that the interest of the EU is much more in negotiating with the US, which it sees as a far bigger market, than on spending time renegotiating a deal with the UK. So that asymmetry counteracts the trade deficit that we have at present. And your last point was on migration. I think from the detail of the question you sent in advance, you pointed to the fact that 7% increase in the population was attributable to EU migrants. I think that's on the high side, but EU migrants are very different from many of the asylum seekers we talk about because they tend, on average, to work far more intensively than domestic residents. The employment rate for Brits is about 75% of the age group. The employment rate for EU migrants is closer to 85%. And the fact that so many more of them are working means that they generate tax revenues. Therefore, and I think this is a crucial point, if we say it's putting pressure on UK public services, the health service, social housing, and so on, the money's coming into the exchequer, and you have to ask the question, if the money's coming in from EU migrants, why isn't that money being used to provide the public services that they require instead of putting pressure on the indigenous population? And there's a dilemma there which the government isn't addressing.
Thank you for this comprehensive answer.
It was 5 different questions.
No, indeed. And if at any point some other panelists, maybe not on this one, but they want to complete the answer, they're welcome to signal that to me. The next question I have is by Lorna Haynes. Lorna.
With regard to environmental policy, could we expect a greater or lesser degree of environmental protection if we leave the EU, and why?
There is actually a UK changing Europe project on this at the University of East Anglia, and Laura has just tweeted this on the Ask EU site, the link. It has a blog, and also it points to a new report which came out last week on the likely effect on environmental policies. And to summarise it, it states that the UK government would gain the opportunity to alter rules and regulations in areas not covered by the EEA, which is the European Economic Area. And these are, for example, environmental restrictions within CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, bathing water, habitats and birds directives. However, they do say that the UK would most likely align itself with the EU if it were to renegotiate in these areas, particularly at the international level or with other member states, because, as Iain was pointing to, I don't think that the UK, and this report states this, would want to take the time and costs involved in renegotiating on these kind of niche areas. So they would probably go along with the EU. But also, most of the environmental policy is actually single market legislation. And this is kind of interesting because if we are going to remain in the single market, this means that we would have to implement environmental regulation anyway, even if we do leave the EU. And there's a lot of directives, particularly on EU standards and product standards in particular, and the UK would have to implement, even under EFTA, these regulations. So the answer to your question, would there be more or less regulation? There probably would be more, in my opinion, because the UK has been putting a block and a stop on a lot of EU environmental legislation to date, So they've been slowing the kind of progress of EU environmental legislation, at the European level by blocking in the Council of Ministers. So if we didn't have a voice in the Council of Ministers of the European Parliament, probably what would happen is we would have more environmental regulation coming from the EU under the single market.
And can Iain complete the answer looking at climate change too?
Yeah, so it's worth making the point that the EU collectively, and including the UK, signed up to what's called the COP21 deal in Paris last December. And I see no reason that would alter as a result of leaving the EU. In fact, Britain has been in the vanguard of trying to push for action on climate change and would probably continue to do so in conjunction with all European countries.
Or the next question is for Catherine, we hope, and is by Benjamin Hewin. Ben? Oh, yes. 1 second, we'll get the microphone up there.
Hello. Has this debate so far been too focused on immigration? And what can we do to ensure we remain focused on the most important issues?
I shall repeat the question because it was not easy to hear it here. It's that the debate is too focused on the issue of migrations, and how can we ensure that the debate stays focused on the most important issues. So we're asking Catherine whether this is a factual statement or not.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, of course, there's been a huge amount of focus on immigration, and I think the Daily Mail and the Daily Express are more concerned with questions about immigration than the public are as a whole. That said, there are parts of the country where there's deep concern about immigration. It's got a lot to do with the age profile and the level of qualifications. Crudely speaking, the higher the educated the person, the less worried they are about immigration, because immigration is not seen as such a threat. The government has made a big deal about immigration, and it was one of the 4 baskets, so-called baskets, as part of David Cameron's deal in February. And there was some potentially quite important big ticket items that he negotiated there, including the emergency brake restricting the amount of benefits that migrant workers can claim. But there's also a lot of confusion about immigration. You may well be aware that David Cameron has said that he would like to get immigration down to the tens of thousands. And the argument for those in favour of leave is that if we pulled out of the EU, we would not be exposed to EU migration. That is true to an extent, but it's worth bearing in mind that at the moment, we do have control over the number of non-EU migrants, so migrants coming from Pakistan, India and so forth, to the UK. And there are more non-EU migrants coming to the UK than there are EU migrants coming to the UK. If there was Brexit, it's widely thought that there would be a reduction, probably about 100,000 reduction. At the moment, there's about 257,000 EU migrants coming to the UK. There would be a reduction possibly by about 100,000 EU migrants, but that still brings us down to still 150,000 who will be coming. And it's likely, because the jobs still need to be done, that there will be an increase in non-EU migration. And those in favour of leave have got mixed views about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Second part of your question is, are there other matters which are important? Absolutely, of course there are. And because EU touches so many aspects of our life. But I would just mention one, which is my area of expertise, which is about workers' rights. Now, there is a quite serious issue. What happens if there's Brexit? What will happen to workers' rights? Now, those who are in favour of us staying will say it will be a disaster for workers. That's not true, because quite a lot of employment law is still domestic employment law. So your rights on unfair dismissal, redundancy, all of those are domestic law rights. But really important protections that we all enjoy and all benefit from, for example, the principle of non-discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, on the grounds of religion, belief, age, all of those come from EU law. Now, then the question is, if there's a vote to leave, will we lose those protections? The argument is from those in favour of leave, no, we won't, because they're so well entrenched in our national systems. But what you have at the moment is EU law provides a floor of rights, and the UK can't deregulate below that floor. If we were to vote to leave, you would lose that floor of rights.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a next question from Tim Taylor. Tim.
The EU has existing free trade agreements with 55 non-EU countries with a combined GDP of $7.7 trillion. Chile has free trade agreements with 17 non-EU countries with a combined GDP of $40.3 trillion. Why are we better off conducting trade as part of the EU?
Okay, yes, this time the question was audible on this side too, and it's for Sam, I think.
So in the spirit of this panel, I'm going to try and answer that in a sort of non-partisan way. I guess that there are sort of several components to this. I mean, the first is that free trade agreements are not all alike and not necessarily as free as you think. I mean, they deal with different things, free provision of goods, services, and all involve, some involve varying degrees of tariff barriers that are steadily removed, etc., differing degrees of coordination around non-tariff barriers as well, around regulation. So I guess the first point to acknowledge in all of this is, if we're to place this versus the alternative of a UK by itself negotiating its own trade deals, well, you must take into account the $19 trillion that are the current EU and the access we have to that market currently, which is far beyond any other free trade agreement, particularly in terms of the non-tariff barriers, which no other agreement has agreed such harmonisation about regulatory standards, etc. So that's kind of the first thing to take into account in whether we'd be more successful or not inside or outside the EU. The second is whether it is better to try and strike bilateral deals or to engage in multilateral deal making. And it's interesting here because Chile itself is actually now signatory to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it has actually sort of put itself more in a block in its trade deals. So, I mean, there are, considerable arguments about the flexibility you have to negotiate by yourself. I would probably say that on our own, you may agree deals quicker, but the question is the strength of your negotiating position within those deals that you strike. So that's obviously quite important. I guess the third part to this is, what are we comparing here? I mean, those numbers look about right for the deals that have been struck to date, but the EU is currently negotiating TTIP, which is quite a controversial potential trade deal with the US. The alternative for the UK if we leave would be a lengthy period of, well, either several of the sort of ideas that have been proposed here, either we go into the EEA and are then able to strike our own trade deals almost immediately, but are bound by the EU law that we apparently did not want to be part of. That would leave us in a good place potentially to negotiate externally, but maybe bound internally. The alternative is that we're striking our own bilateral deals with the EU on a case-by-case basis, in which case I think we'll be highly bound up in those negotiations for a very long time just to get back to a sort of normalized trading arrangements with, presumably with the whole of the EU. So, those are, I think, the components to consider in that question.
That's a great answer, but the question is so important. I would like Iain to finish off with additional evidence.
Well, I'd query your statistics to begin with, because you say 17 countries, and you say, I think you said, in the written version you had 57, but I think you said $47 trillion. The UK economy is around 1.8 trillion pounds, so let's call that 3 trillion. We say it's the fifth biggest economy in the world, so 17 times the UK, you'd have to be the trading partners. That's inconceivable. You must have got something wrong in your numbers. Now, a separate answer to this is that we should recognise that in the UK economy, less than 10% of what we produce now is manufacturing. You might think that that is dramatic, but that's simply a long-run trend, and much more of what we do is services. I happened to check the figures the other day, and since 1997, the share of service exports from our economy has gone from 26% to 42%, and it's on an upward trajectory. What matters for us for the future is market access in services and much less in goods. So the free trade deals that focus only on goods are going to miss the critical point for this economy.
Thank you. I have a next question in line from Anne Price.
Can you tell me, what are the actual barriers to trading in Europe were we to vote to leave the Union?
Okay, it's a nice follow-up question on the previous one, and maybe we start with Sam again.
Yeah, so I'll do a quick plug for my former employer, the Treasury, in saying that I think the potential barriers are set out quite well there. I won't, sort of vow by that their calculation of the numbers is necessarily right. They've obviously come up with some modelling assumptions. There are various modelling assumptions you can make. But as a description of the kind of barriers that you face, I mean, there's essentially the tariffs or quotas, fixed prices on all imports and exports into the EU, or quantitative restrictions. Then the potential customs checks, and although these don't actually involve a direct cost in themselves, it's a costly business certifying that your goods were made in your country, etc. And then finally, once again, sort of coming back to non-tariff barriers. Now, it all depends very much on the deal that we strike if we were to leave. But non-tariff barriers are extraordinarily important. And I'll give you one example. I try not to make it too arcane. I used to work in financial services policy, and it is quite complex. But I was dealing with an issue of something called central counterparties or clearing houses that deal with the security in our markets. And there's a big issue there between the US and the EU over the recognition of standards that are set for the safe amount of collateral you have to hold. Now, those kind of issues arise when you have two sort of actors who come to their own conclusions on how it's best to regulate things. But it can lead to intractable differences, because if you're on the one country is saying you only need to hold half the capital of the other, well, it's clear in an international market where everyone will go. So at that point, it becomes very difficult for you just to acknowledge the other side's standards. You have to erect trade walls, otherwise all of your business leaves. So that these can potentially be disastrous for trade. So those are sort of characteristically what they are. The extent to which they are barriers depends on what kind of deal you do. And the EEA would be the one that involves the least imposition of new barriers, but would leave again customs checks to export goods into the EU. Various others would involve possibly tariffs, but most likely, if we wanted to have the freedom to legislate in our own parliament, as many on the out campaign want to do, this would lead to various non-tariff barriers over time, which may also then lead to trade restrictions.
Okay, thank you. You give us almost a picture of what could happen with the custom checks and the tariff barriers, and then the non-regulatory barriers. So I think these practical examples help us to understand the matters better.
There's a two-word answer to your question, Anne. Nobody knows.
But we can visualize the kind of trade obstacles that would exist. And then one could think about the solutions to those. I think the next one is Amy Foreman. Amy?
Can you hear me? Yeah. If we were to be voted to leave the EU, what do you think the impact will be on scientific and other kinds of research funding, and how do you think we could tackle that issue?
Okay, is Alison ready to answer this one? Okay.
Okay, if the UK were to leave the EU, it wouldn't really affect our ability to apply for research grants like Horizon 2020 grants or European Research Council funding if we remain under the EEA or EFTA, yeah? For example, Norway is not a member, but as an EE member, they can apply for funding. They can lead on funding. And Switzerland previously could actually, I think that they can't lead on funding grants, but they can participate. But like I said previously, because Switzerland brought in stringent immigration laws, they were constrained in what they could apply for. However, the danger in this is really changes which could be made to future conditions if the UK wasn't a member. So if they change the terms of funding in the future and we could not vote on that, that could pose a potential dilemma for the UK.
And Catherine can add on that.
I don't want just to focus on the funding, but I also want to recognise there will be a major issue in respect of attracting talent and retaining international talent in the event of a Brexit. Now, obviously, much depends on what's put in its place. If Brexit means it's going to be replaced by membership of the European Economic Area, what I'm about to say is less relevant. If, however, Brexit means just that and pulling up the drawbridge, it will be really very serious for our international competitiveness. I was very struck. A colleague of mine at Trinity in Cambridge is Martin Rees, who is the Astronomer Royal, and he painted a very vivid picture to me about when he first started out in science in the early 70s. And he said that he never interacted with international figures from the world of science. And the only time he met international figures was when he went to conferences in the US. And he said the world has changed dramatically in the scientific field, that numbers of EU nationals who are working in British universities is very high. They bring talent, they bring ideas, and they bring energy. And this is deeply enriching. And his great fear is that if there is a Brexit and the drawbridge is pulled up, we will lose a lot of that. So it's not just the funding, but it's also the individuals who make Britain great in terms of our scientific endeavour.
I just wanted to add to that. We get 1.7 billion annually in EU funding, and we get a disproportionate amount of university funding compared to other EU member states. Germany is second up, and they get 1.2. And there have been complaints about this from other member states, particularly from southern European states and central and eastern European states, that the UK gets more funding, than the rest of Europe.
Thank you very much. We still have one question, and then the floor will be open by Dan Mazur. I want to read it anyway. Oh, okay. Thank you, Dan.
Hi. My question is, how will the Brexit
Go
affect...
slowly because it's audible, but just audible.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
How will the Brexit affect current and prospective EU students of the university, especially in regards to programs such as Erasmus?
Okay, that's a great question given where we are. Thanks.
The immediate answer to that is don't panic, because if there is a vote for Brexit on the 23rd of June, the UK will look identical on the 24th of June. There is a process called the Article 50 process, which David Cameron will be obliged probably to trigger. Most people assume that he will trigger it pretty much straight away within a matter of weeks, but I have heard it argued by the Leave campaign that actually he might delay it for a longer period. But whatever, under the Article 50 process, there are 2 years for the UK and the EU to negotiate what exit might look like, and also with the possibility of some sort of arrangement about future engagement between the UK and the EU. Many people think that 2 years is an unrealistic timescale, and there is a possibility by unanimous agreement of the states to extend that 2-year period. Assuming it is 2 years, then nothing will change in terms of the fact that EU law will continue to apply, and so EU students who are here at present will carry on enjoying exactly the same rights and paying home fees, not overseas fees. At the end of that 2 years, if the European Economic Area Agreement is the chosen solution, that's the Norway solution, it will mean free movement of persons will continue, and so students will carry on enjoying the rights that they've got. If, however, no deal is put into place and the drawbridge is drawn up, then it will mean that EU students at that stage become overseas or international students and will have to pay. But and pay international fees rather than home fees, but there will be transitional arrangements put into place. So the bottom line is, for the next 2 years, don't panic.
I see a hand there. Do I see other? I see many hands. So one from there. I take these 3, 1, 2, and 3.
All together?
No. Maybe not. Because they may be very different.
Okay, we've heard a lot about people coming to this country to work. What would be the position if we left the EU for all the thousands of British workers that work in countries like Spain and live in Spain? What would their position be if we left?
Yeah,
Catherine,
thank you for that. The answer is, again, it much depends on whether some alternative is put into place, like the European Economic Area, the Norway solution, in which case their position will be protected as it is at present. If no deal is put into place, then their position becomes more vulnerable. What's likely to happen is that in that 2-year period I mentioned before, there will be transitional arrangements negotiated both for EU migrants who are already in the UK and for British migrants who are in other member states. However, their lives will not be as good as it is at the moment, because at the moment they enjoy emergency health care in the host states in which they're living. They enjoy the principle of equal treatment in respect of access to benefits, in respect of access to other services. And those risk being withdrawn because they will be treated as overseas nationals. And then it will turn on domestic law so the law of Spain, the law of France, where those individuals are, what rights they will be entitled to. Now, those countries are all signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights, and so it's unlikely that they will be denied their homes, their property, their right to reside. But at the moment, it is much easier because EU law makes it much easier. So their position will become eventually more vulnerable, but not overnight.
Okay, we just go up one row with that. Another question by a young adult.
Good evening. My question is quite different to that. You can correct me if I'm wrong in what I say. All our NATO allies are saying, please do not leave Europe. We will be weaker in consequence. Every European ally and Commonwealth ally wants us to stay. Only one man wants us to leave, Vladimir Putin. Is this part of his plan to create political instability in Europe? Is Brexit what Putin wants you to do?
Thank you. Hey, Iain, you take this.
In my best Russian, da.
Any other panelist wants to? Excellent. I had a question up there. Yes, that's a lady.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me down there.
Okay.
My question was actually about migration, but since that's already been taken, I'll change it slightly and maybe ask Susan if you could tell us a little bit more about where the sort of seeming discontent that seems to be behind a lot of the Brexit movement is coming from, in your opinion. And maybe also if you could tell us a little bit about your opinion about what a Brexit might mean for some of the discontent we're seeing in other European countries. Would that sort of fuel it or scale it back? What could we sort of expect that a Brexit could mean for the growing discontentment that we're seeing across Europe? Thank you.
Thank you.
So what, in the current context of this referendum campaign, is that and prior to the campaign, what has fueled a lot of the discontent, and the UK is the most Eurosceptic of northern EU member states, has been about issues such as immigration and issues too, perhaps about identity. But in the context of this campaign, the polling that's been done seems to suggest that those who are supporting a leave vote do focus on immigration as an important issue. I think it's the question about what the vote means and what the outcome will mean across the other member states is very interesting, because we've seen in the past where we've had 50 referendum votes in other EU member states, and they have had knock-on effects. And they have halted the European integration process at time. If you think about the 2005 votes on the constitutional treaty or the EU constitution, and the Dutch and the French voting no on the constitution, it halted that process. The UK was going to hold a vote and it halted it. So you can imagine that the vote, this vote, could increase or give hope to other Eurosceptic movements across EU member states.
Thank you, Susan. Iain, the final word on this is?
Well, I was recently told that the Dutch in particular were getting increasingly worried that a Brexit vote would cause an unravelling of the EU taking the Dutch in the same direction as the UK. So when I was in The Hague fairly recently, I raised this question at the Dutch Foreign Ministry, and a very senior official was giving a talk. I said to him, will the Dutch follow the Brits? And he said, there is a limit to our stupidity.
I let you ask the question, and then Pete, can we go to Cornwall after that? Yeah, we can try at least. Yes, there is one question there. I know there are many others.
Thanks. I'd like you to speculate on what will happen if, as is increasingly likely, the result is narrowly one way or the other. For how long will this issue then stay in its box?
Susan, is a public opinion mood whether the issue will linger on for a long time or will be settled? Is that the question? Yeah.
That's it.
And James.
I can offer an opinion on on this. I think there was some sense that giving voters a say on this and the electorate would settle it once and for all. That was what Cameron said. We need the voters to decide on this once and for all. But in some sense, yeah, it settles it once and for all if they give the right answer. Will we have, but obviously there will be no, I don't think, no opportunity if it's the wrong answer for a second go at this. So perhaps the other panelists might want to say.
Maybe James, please.
Nothing really to add there to what Susan said.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know there are other questions. Is it on this specifically that you want? You still have to wait a second for the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yes, just to follow on from what Susan was saying, also that might hinge on how the spread of votes in terms of Scotland turns out. If it was to be seen that the difference was tipped by the Scottish vote, then maybe the controversy would continue.
Yes.
And expand the Scottish independence vote.
Thank you. A caricature of the argument to stay is, that, and I keep hearing this, is we know that the European institutions are all broken, but there's all these benefits of staying, so we should stay because of benefit X, Y, and Z. If we do stay, are the European institutions set up in such a way with the decision-making mechanisms and the number of countries that those changes that we all want can actually happen? Or is it so sclerotic that it's just going to carry on the way it is?
Yeah, you want to start, Sam, since you've seen these institutions up close.
Is it too sclerotic? I think actually, given that you are trying to bring together 28 countries at the meeting table every time, it is actually remarkable what can be achieved, and sometimes in a short space of time. But no, don't get me wrong. There are countless ways in which things could be improved, and that arguably with a mandate to remain, that the UK should then go and try and make further progress in reforming institutions in a way it sees as positive.
Okay, I promise I will go up there. Who's got the microphone? Yeah. No, it's starting from in a diagonal. There are two questions there. Yes. Okay, and then the person with the white shirt and the tie, and then another one up there. Yes.
My question is, to what extent, in the case of a Brexit, would the Brexit influence the financial services that are in UK? Because we've seen companies such as HSBC that...
We had seen part of that question before, but some specifically on the financial services.
Yeah. So in financial services, it very much depends on what deal we do accept. If we're in the EEA, then we'll continue to benefit from all the passporting rights, etc. we currently have. So it may be quite similar in terms of the mechanics of how the legislation works. But of course, we would give up our vote. And that would be a considerable problem for us. I was responsible for negotiating the Markets and Financial Instruments Directive, and that's a piece of legislation that deals with stock exchanges, derivatives markets, where the UK has an overwhelming market share throughout the EU. There are various countries within the EU who would take quite a different path in how that piece of legislation developed, and without our involvement there, we would never have ended up with the legislation we did. I know this at first hand also because one of the alternatives we might have is a Swiss-style arrangement where we negotiate bilateral deals with the EU. Now, Switzerland in services is classed as what's called a third country, So they have to go through a process of what's called an equivalence assessment. On every piece of legislation, they have to be deemed to have an equivalent set of rules in place to deal with the EU. However, in some issues, there can be non-tariff barriers, as I've mentioned before, that just means it's impossible for them to access the EU. And one example is that Switzerland has a very large private banking industry, which relies on being able to sell derivatives, all sorts of structured products, etc., to wealthy people in Germany, the UK, etc. And one of the features of this legislation would be to effectively disallow that happening remotely from Switzerland. And there was no element of the legislation that would allow for this. Now, Switzerland didn't have a seat at the table in these negotiations. As it turned out, they managed to preserve access in the end, but they were very lucky because there were very few people in the room who wanted to do them any favours. And this is not a point of people disliking Switzerland, but it's a question of political realism. When you have limited voting capital on a directive, you can't just do favours for your mates. You know, you have to concentrate with what your interests are there. So I think, you know, it depends, but we would, you know, we could, if we were in the EEA, retain our passporting rights, but have very little influence in how legislation is developed. Or if we are then fully outside, well, we could be blocked access, and then, you know, things would come into play, like where international firms are choosing to headquarter themselves in order to gain access to the passport.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman with the white shirt and the tie. Yes.
Hello, can you? Yeah, you can. My question is a bit focused, but it's also really big. I suppose my concern is about pensions. And if we leave the EU and we almost go into another recession, what do you think the real ramifications are for pensions across the age groups? Is there anything that we aren't really talking about that we should in relation to pensions?
I'm just asking the panelists. Iain, can we start?
I think rather than saying it be pensions specifically, it would depend on the impact on the economy. If the result of whatever scenario you envisage is the economy has a downturn, that's going to lower rates of return, is going to make pension funds far less sustainable than they are at present, irrespective of what happens to BHS, that is. And if the economy stabilises, then there's no particular reason to think that pensions will be affected, because it's tangential to what our relationship is with the EU.
Thanks. Can I move? I know there was still question, but I'd like to move to this sector. I see embarrassment of choice. Maybe we start from that gentleman there, the far left, as far as I'm concerned. Then we go up and move towards the right.
What effect does the panel think the recent intervention of Barack Obama will have on people's views, and do they think it was a right and/or wise decision by the US president to intervene?
Do you, Susan, know the answer? That's a public opinion.
Is that because of public opinion, or have an American
How do
accent?
people?
Yeah, I guess. Of course, it depends, I think, in terms of how these sorts of events have an effect on perceptions that people carry into their voting decisions. Obviously, on the one hand, the Leave campaign is saying, you know, we should not have Americans coming over here and telling us how to vote, and it really is no, you know, this lame duck president cannot say that the UK will not be able to negotiate any trade deal with America. True enough, we are in the midst in the US in a presidential election, so to say that may be a bit premature. On the other hand, Barack Obama may resonate, and his message may resonate with UK voters. I think in particular what he had to say about the youth vote was particularly important. So what effect it will have, perhaps they may have been worried it may have backfired, his message, but clearly he did. I mean, quite bold statement about the position of the EU.
Okay, there was a lady here that caught my attention. Then we go back.
I'm just interested because a lot of the answers to the questions have been of the form, if we stay as part of the EEA, it will more or less stay the same. If we don't, things will be very different and rather difficult. And so I'm wondering if there is a vote to leave, but we negotiate being part of the EEA, would there actually be any substantial freedoms that had been gained by that process?
So, James, you can look at that. Or your coordinator.
The EEA is not a total palliative. It's not a complete alternative to EU membership for various reasons. First, yes, it will give access to the single market, but in respect to financial services, the EEA hasn't fully implemented all of the European obligations. In respect to single market legislation, the EEA states have to implement it, but have no seat at the negotiating table, although they do have a degree of soft influence, particularly Norway, which is the biggest of the states. In respect of international agreements, the EU has many more free trade agreements with non-member states. The EFTA countries, and forgive the jargon, but the UK would have to be a member of EFTA before it could become a member of the EEA. The EFTA countries have a number of free trade agreements, but nowhere near as many. But the EEA is basically focused on the single market. There's no agriculture, there's no fisheries, and obviously the security and other aspects, none of that affects the EEA. Now, the question, if we were to leave, is would we accept a very second division membership of the single market, because we would have no say, we would have no direct influence, we would have no voting rights over EU legislation which would apply to us. It's also worth bearing in mind that Norway is the 10th largest contributor to the EU budget. So for those people who are hoping that leaving the EU would give us a saving of the £280 million a week that we send to the EU, they would be disappointed to discover that actually we would still be paying a large amount of money. But we would not have the influence that we have at the moment.
There's one other aspect of this which I think is worth stressing, and that's what the Treasury said in the report it published last week, where it evaluated the different options. And the irony of what they're saying is the option closest to existing membership is the one that is least risky for us. Now, this ties in with the fact that the EEA or EFTA is 4 countries, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. I'm told that in Brussels negotiation, they're known as the nils.
Okay, thanks. Let's start from that question. And then the lady up there, yes, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. The panel mentioned that following a Brexit, Cameron would have to invoke the process to renegotiate our terms with the EU. Would the panel like to speculate whether they think Cameron will actually be the Prime Minister that will be able to do that, and whether he should be the person to do it, having failed in his ability to get the country to stay in?
Alison?
Me?
I'm just looking at there's no professor of government here, right?
Maybe Susan.
Maybe Susan.
Well, I'll just answer it from the perspective of the polls and the positioning within the Leave campaign. A lot of people are commenting that really the Leave campaign and the conservative leaders within the Leave campaign are just positioning themselves for the next to be the next prime minister or the next leader of the Conservative Party, which is unfortunate. It turns this very important process into it politicizes it in a bit. And the other worry, and I think this might amongst the Remain campaign, is that if you look at the polling around Cameron's popularity, it is going down, and it has declined a bit. So there is a concern that amongst the Remain campaign that sort of a leadership and that effect and the message and the believability of the Remain message is being lost a little bit. That said, Cameron's popularity is going down or declining, yet when asked in polls without Cameron's name and just about the Remain campaign and about how credible it is, that has had a good week. So the Remain campaign has had a good week, not so much Cameron. Whether that's due to the visit of Obama or not sure. So I think that's an important question, and that's what the polling tells us at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Susan, for trying this. The lady up there, next to you. Thank you for your patience.
Hello. I'd like to ask about corruption in the EU, because year on year the financial audit reports reveals and calculates a figure for error in expenditure to be about 4.4%, which accounts for about £6 billion. So I just want to ask, really, why does this figure remain so high year on year? And if we do remain, what are the plans, if any, to improve the situation?
What is it for the British government?
Say that again?
What is it for the British government, the error rate?
I don't know.
Why don't you know?
I'm just asking as we're part of this
because
commission.
The answer to your question is it's a form of transparency that tells you that we know more about the EU's accounts than we do about domestic government or local government. And the error rate is something as simple as me filling in a form wrongly for when I say we spent the money on this or that. It's very rare for it to be explicit corruption.
But that is a lot of money. And it's higher than, in the reports reveal, it's higher than they would like. And every year they say this, but every year it continues to be around the same percentage.
If you're alluding to the Court of Auditors, and there is a myth that the Court of Auditors has never signed off the EU accounts. That's not true. They've signed off the accounts every year since 2007. There are certainly there's money goes missing. We know that there is an element of corruption going on, but likewise the same can be said in the UK government. What we don't get is the same levels of transparency, and I think what's interesting, what this whole debate has shown to us, is that we apply quite rightly a very critical scrutiny to the EU institutions. But we don't always necessarily apply the same degree of critical scrutiny to our own domestic institutions.
Wait, I had to listen.
We have a question from Cornwall by Twitter.
Can you read it?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So, let me come in. She'll pick this up. Boris Johnson said an exit would mean that we could renegotiate back in. How likely is this?
We just need to
I think,
a concise answer.
Well, I think the concise answer, of course, anything's possible, and it is possible for the UK to renegotiate, to re-enter. But what's important to bear in mind is that any state that joins the EU must also commit itself to joining the euro. And at the moment, we have extensive opt-outs. We have an opt-out from the Eurozone. We have an opt-out from the area of freedom, security and justice. We have an opt-out from a large number of the measures concerning the police. We would lose all of those opt-outs were we to leave and then 10, 20 years down the line asked to be readmitted. It's a precondition of admission that it's a sort of tabula rasa. We start from scratch.
And there's what Boris, as you know, is part Turkish. And you should recall that Turkey has been negotiating to join the EU since 1963.
I have another question from Cornwall, and try to summarize it because it's a quote from The Independent on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership being, that's the quote, I assume from The Independent, the biggest threat to society and an assault on democracy because of the investor-state dispute settlement system, which allows companies to sue governments if those governments' policies cause a loss of profits. And I guess the question is inviting an answer. I can tell you it's not true. There is no provision where a company can just think with your head. How could a treaty create a situation where a company can sue for the loss of profits? But maybe Alison wants to give a more disciplined answer. A commercial law professor can answer that.
Okay. I'm somewhat familiar with TTIP because I've been looking at audiovisual services negotiations under TTIP. It's true the TTIP doesn't have any provision that guarantees any level of profit or anything like that, nor has it provisions that entitle companies to compensation. With the EU negotiating, we do have quite a large voice, and they would probably bargain for a higher level of public interest protection. For example, in audiovisual media services and education, which was originally on the table, and Pascal Lamy, that he bargained to have these services taken off the table because the EU has long lobbied for an exemption to audiovisual services. For originally goods and now services under the GATS agreement, and this is a bilateral treaty which will extend that.
I'm very happy to see there is so much enthusiasm, especially this section up there. I think maybe we start with this lady with blonde hair. This is a middle row.
Like some people here today, I'm still undecided, which is why I decided to come. I don't trust the government booklet that they sent out because obviously they want us to stay. And then I don't trust the exit campaign because obviously they want me to vote out. So what would you advise someone to do to make sure that they are doing the correct research from reliable sources?
There's also another very good website. I declare an interest here. It's called Full Fact, and it's an independent charity, and its job is to fact check both claims made by the UK government and also by the EU, and it's deliberately intended to be as accessible as possible. I have a degree of involvement, which is why I'm declaring an interest, but it is a charity whose charitable objectives is to be as objective as possible. So I would suggest look at Full Fact, so full and fact, F-A-C-T, and also the UK and the Changing Europe, which is also committed to be non-partisan.
That's all right, thank you. Yes.
I was just wondering what the panel thought of the media debate, the quality of it, and who's winning.
The quality of the media debate.
Yeah.
Depending on the media we're considering.
Yeah, it does
radio,
depend
television.
on it does depend a lot on the outlet. And the earlier question about why is the UK so Eurosceptic, and one of the answers that has always been given is because the media are so negative about the EU, and in some respects, in some respects that may be the case. However, we've looked at the media coverage of the EU in the UK, but I think, as other panelists have pointed out, you have to take this in the context of what they say about national politics, and they're negative about both. And in fact, they're most negative in terms of the coverage about the EU, sort of about these myths. And we know that The Sun or, various papers, they come up with these figures, 3 million new migrants, and so that there's that element to it. People tend to trust, and probably rightly, they trust television. Of all media sources, they trust television. And those who are right now looking at the media coverage and assessing the quality of it, because we know that the media are important providers of information, have generally said, that television tends to be a bit more balanced, and people do trust it. But a lot of commentators have said the media coverage has not been terribly good.
The broadcast media are very heavily regulated in this country, and they're committed to impartiality. And for this reason, if you're listening to John Humphreys in the morning on the Today programme, they have to show both sides. And there's been some frustration that there hasn't been more kind of journalistic input to this. I was listening to Iain Duncan Smith being interviewed yesterday, and there were some statistics there, and I thought, oh, I wish the journalists would come back and say, well, no, yes, this is right, this is not right. But I think that the broadcast media, actually I know this because I've asked them, are quite worried. I'm not talking specifically about the BBC, but many of the channels, about seeming impartial and conforming to Ofcom's impartiality rules. The newspapers do not have this regulation imposed upon them. They have a lot more freedom, and newspapers tend to have an editorial line, so you will see different opinions coming out in newspapers.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, it's 8:30. I'm just delighted that there are all these questions coming in. Looking at Peter, Pete says that we can carry on for 5 more minutes. We also have the Twitter feed open all evening.
Yeah, please don't hesitate to email us if you have individual questions.
Maybe that's the way to go through the. We can. I think the panelists are keen on that as well. So where do we go? You're okay. One question here, because I haven't picked anyone here.
The lady waving her hand behind the man in the red sweater.
And the lady waving her hand behind the man with the red sweater. Oh, I guess the microphone is there, and then we'll come to you next.
Okay.
You're going to be next, because the microphone is already there. Yes.
Is that me? Sorry, yeah, she did that on my behalf because she's far more influential than I am. My concern is that the general debate, even in this forum, has been almost exclusively preoccupied by economics and legislation. The eloquent young man at the front started to touch upon strategic influence and foreign policy and defence, and he got a one-word answer. There are some big questions, I think, that need to be answered on that. One, for example, is, as a small island nation, do we still have a legitimate right to be on the UN Permanent Security Council if we leave the EU? Do you think that those issues, strategy and foreign policy, are overlooked?
Is it a question for James, or?
A little bit outside of my comfort zone, but I think yes. I mean, I think that the debate is focused so much on the economic position and not so much on the defence and foreign policy, and also on the social policy. In terms of my own area, consumer law within commercial law, so much of the debate about EU consumer law has been on the economics of it, about the economics of trade within the internal market. There are, of course, wide issues about social policy as well, and protection of the vulnerable, protection of weaker parties, etc. So yes, I agree. My area of expertise is not in defence or security, but I agree that the debate has been perhaps too focused on the economics of the case for or against, and there are these wider issues about social policy, defence, etc., etc. So I think you're right.
Katia, your turn. Oh no, Iain wanted to add something. Sorry.
Okay, I plead guilty to the one-word answer because I was simply trying to agree with the young man in front of us that Russia is a threat. But if we look around the world today, the threats or the questions for which the EU can be part of an answer are much less economic than they have been in the past. What we see now is a big topic like climate change, an even bigger topic like how to cope with the 60 million displaced persons globally who are behind the pressure we see crossing the Mediterranean, the terror threats, the environmental threats beyond climate change. These are all the things we should be focusing on today. And if we look at this purely through the lens of economics, we're missing the fact that the reason for cooperation at European level is much more in these other areas which are emerging on the political agenda than on the ones that we focused on up to now. So you're entirely correct to emphasize this. And I hope the young man didn't take umbrage with me answering my pidgin Russian, because I was simply agreeing with him.
Thank you,
Iain. So we've established that if we leave, that we're so uncertain of everything, almost everything. But what are we certain of? Is everything going to, if we stay, will everything stay how it is now? Or do we know what will happen?
I can talk about.
Yes.
There is, that's largely been forgotten, I've noticed, in the debate, the fact that the Prime Minister did negotiate a package that is meant to alter our relationship with the EU. I was sort of tangentially involved in this because there's been many aspects, at least of the economics, and I'm going to go back to economics for a moment, have been Treasury policy for some time. And so the sort of emerging picture of a Europe where we are under no obligation to join the euro and are not expected at any point that will happen. The balancing of our interests as a euro out versus euro ins, non-discrimination clauses, all of these things that are put in there are designed to sort of establish a steady state EU in which we continue to be, our own, have our own currency and, exist in a trading zone kind of arrangement. So those, I personally think that is quite significant. It's also reasonably significant in that it is one of the few times in our recent history where the UK has exerted influence in the European debate and to a large extent got at least what the government wanted on those economic issues at least.
Yeah, can I add to that, Claudio? I think that two things are going on at present. One is that the idea that some pro-Europeans had 20 or 30 years ago, that a federal superstate would be the outcome, that's gone. And instead, if you look across the continent, you see groupings of countries that want to do some things and other groupings of countries that want to do other. That said, Britain is very often the outsider. And if Britain stays, it's going to face some uncomfortable decisions about the things that it's going to participate in at European level that we don't at present, especially when you have to accept that at least the Eurozone is going to integrate a bit more closely around things like banking union because it requires them to make the euro function effectively. So there will be a tense period ahead for Britain if we stay in as well.
And if I could just add to that, in respect of immigration, the basket on immigration is the first time ever in respect to the single market where integration has gone backwards, there have been restrictions imposed on integration rather than going forward. And that really is a first. And so there will be restrictions on how migrant workers claim benefits in the UK. And because this requires an amendment to an existing piece of legislation, that means that other member states can take advantage of that possibility as well. And I've already heard the Austrian Foreign Minister say that he likes the idea of the emergency brake and may well extend it to Austria. So there may be some interesting consequences. And as I say, there has been a full stop, at least, put on integration for the first time.
Okay, we have time for one more question that I'll take from you up there.
Hi. So far, the debate was very much UK-centric, and I would like to know what actually Brexit would mean for the European unity, a unity that is currently crumbling.
Okay, that's a great question to finish off.
That's for you, Claudio. You're an Italian.
Well, but then Susan. Who can answer this? Maybe James?
You repeat the question? I couldn't quite hear the question.
What are the implications of Brexit for the rest of the EU?
We had already a question on the expats, but that's a different. And then Susan answered on public opinion in other countries.
Okay, well, no one else will answer it. I'll try to. I think it is going to cause pressures on other countries for reasons that we've heard already, because there will be encouragement given to anti-EU forces in countries like France, with Marine Le Pen and the Front National, in Germany, where an anti-Euro party called Alternative for Deutschland is becoming much more anti-EU instead of just anti-Euro. It's going to create tensions across the continent. Pandora's box would be the two-word answer.
Yeah, I can answer it for my own sector because there are, like I said, there are these 650 channels licensed. And I think that if they were no longer licensed in the UK, because there have been member states lobbying to get jurisdiction over broadcasts, that would affect, in my opinion, the provision of certain channels and news programs, across the UK. And I think that would affect the national debates. Yeah, I mean, I always give the example of Sky because it's one you're familiar with. The Sky Deutschland, the Sky Italia. Sky Italia runs Sky News, and it provides a lot of information which is not available on national Italian channels. I can say that the same across Europe, yeah, that there's channels broadcasting from the UK in every member state, yeah, and I think that if this was to change, or if certain member states like Poland or Hungary were to impose restrictions, close down television or radio stations broadcasting from the UK, that could affect national policy debates, national political debates as well.
Until a few years ago, there were still members of the European Parliament and some officers at the Commission that were thinking at least if the UK were to leave, we could get faster with our regulations under discussion with our proposed legislation. But I think Iain was spot on. Over the last few years, the climate of opinion, at least at the level of members of the European Parliament and key officers, has changed. Now they're worried about these kind of implications for Euroscepticism and European disintegration. Okay, I didn't want to use disintegration as the last word of this wonderful evening, but certainly I want to thank the audience here and apparently in Cornwall for this enthusiastic participation to our evening. The debate and discussion goes on Twitter and through our website, and also the ESRC program on UK and a Changing Europe keeps on churning out information as well as opportunities for discussion. And thank you most of all to our panelists who have answered so many different questions. Thank you.